Hey guys, it's Casey and welcome to the first ever Reviewsday Tuesday, where I will be reviewing whatever book I've read recently and recommend some of my favorites for, anyone looking for something really interesting to read. My first pick is Riddley Walker by Russell Hoban. It's a sci-fi novel that takes place 2,000 odd years after a nuclear war has decimated England. The government has been separated from the rest of England, or inland as it's called, and sends the Prime Minister and the Westminster around inland holding puppet shows that control the population. So they tell stories and they introduce legislation, and it's sort of a pseudo-religious political puppet show. So if you're looking at this cover, that right there is the iconic British Punch from Punch and Judy. That is a decimated England in the background. And the book follows the life of 12-year-old Riddley Walker, who has just been orphaned and is now discovering that the government isn't, as good as he thought it was. It's kind of corrupt, and people are trying to get back to the way things were before this nuclear war in the 90s. This book was published in 1980, so it's a little old school, but I find it was one of the best post-apocalyptic novels I've ever read. The characters in this book, having grown up 2,000 years after a nuclear war, do not have the kind of technology and education you'd expect for a future-placed novel. So basically it's like they've gone back to the Iron Age, except they're recycling old iron machinery and digging it out of the mud, but they have no idea what any of it does. They're fascinated by the fact that, our generation had pictures on the wind, movies, and ships that sailed on the sky, aircraft, spacecraft, and what the main focus of the novel is this character, Riddley, walking around trying to sort of rediscover some of the knowledge that our past had. So they call it the One Big One, which is the splitting of the atom. And that's where their religious figure, USA, comes from. So USA is part USA, obviously the United States. So it puts some of United States history into it, but also it's part of Saint Eustace, which is an old painting where they're getting this sort of Jesus figure, and the puppet shows all-star USA, and they tell about his travels, and it's supposed to teach lessons. And Riddley's father is a connection man, so what he does is he is supposed to watch these puppet shows and then interpret it for the public. When he passes away at the beginning of the novel, Riddley, who's just turned 12 years old and is therefore considered a man in their society, must take over his job and be the connection man. So he's already been more educated than most of the characters in this book because he can read and he can write. And so he doesn't really do a very good job as a connection man. And he finds this puppet, which we find out later is Punch from Punch and Judy. It's just a really interesting take on how children are forced to grow up in situations where there is no innocence. This might look like a children's novel, and even the way it's written, which is completely phonetically, there is no spelling conventions in this book whatsoever. It looks like a children's book, but it really isn't, because there's lots of violence and lots of sex and lots of horrible things happening to 12-year-olds that you really don't think should happen to 12-year-olds, and it's fairly shocking. There's someone's account of being sexually assaulted. There's children being murdered and cannibalism and dogs ripping people apart. So, if you're squeamish, not quite the novel for you, but it's not a children's book, but it's written as if it might be. It's written phonetically. So, it's hard to explain, but it's called Riddley Speak, and it's just because the language has evolved over 2,000 years that English isn't really recognizable. There's some idioms that got lost in here, and so things don't necessarily add up to the way we see English today, but it's one of those books where you have to slow down and read it very diligently, I'd almost say. It's very double meaning. Every single word, all the names of all the characters, they all mean something, but they're all twisted a little bit. So like the Archbishop of Cambrai is the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he's also has hardship, and there's, Even Riddley Walker, he walks and he tells riddles. Like, it's not that hard to understand, but you have to slow down and read the book very thoroughly because the language itself forces you to take a step back from how you interpret English and how you think of English. And I just found that really fantastic. It's actually sort of amazing and baffling, the fact that our brains can understand something like this, because nothing is spelled correctly, there is no syntax, the grammar has all gone to crap. Like, it's like reading a child who has never gone to school telling a story, and it's really just a collection of all these myths and legends and Riddley Walker accounting his tales, and it's just really interesting to read as if a language has evolved over time. So it's a lot like reading something like Clockwork Orange or Newspeak in 1984, or I can't even think of another example. It's just so different from anything else I've ever read, and it's really exciting to learn that your brain can recognize sounds and signals that don't necessarily correlate to what we've been taught. So the first couple of pages will be really, really hard to read because you don't have any knowledge of this language, which isn't really English at all anymore. It's sort of an evolved English. So it's like the difference between our English and Old English of like Beowulf. But after you start reading it and actually like recognizing the patterns and the words and the phrasing, it starts becoming second nature to read it. By the end of the book, I was barely struggling at all. And it's in this basically foreign language. It's like starting from scratch with no knowledge of English. It's fantastic, it is exciting, and it made my brain explode, this book. For anyone who wants to read about children who are mutants and run around killing each other, and, you know, post-apocalyptic, anyone who's into that zombie genre, that post-apocalyptic genre, who like The Hunger Games, or 1984, or Lord of the Flies, you'll love this book. This book is pretty heavy. Again, it's Russell Hoban's Riddley Walker. It's available on Amazon. It's available from most libraries. It is fantastic. I would highly recommend you read this book. Thanks for listening to my first ever Reviewsday Tuesday for Russell Hoban's Riddley Walker. See you again soon.